Imagine sitting beside a busy waterfront road at lunchtime, sharing a drink and laughing with your friends. Then something cold reaches your shoes. At first, you think it's water, but it feels thick and sticky, and the air suddenly carries a strange, sweet smell. You look down. Dark brown syrup is spreading across the street. Before you can work out what it is, you hear a deep rumble, then a sharp hiss. You turn toward the sound and see a massive wall of molasses rushing straight through the neighborhood. That sounds like a disaster invented for a cartoon, but at lunchtime on January 15th, 1919, it happened in Boston's North End. A giant steel tank on Commercial Street had ruptured, releasing roughly 2.3 million gallons of molasses into a crowded waterfront district. The surge smashed buildings, damaged an elevated railway, tore through workplaces and homes, killed 21 people, and injured about 150. Molasses is supposed to move slowly. That is practically its whole public image. But when millions of gallons break free at once, slow leaves the conversation. The strange liquid made the disaster memorable. The reason it happened made it important. This was not a freak event that nobody could have imagined. The tank had leaked, it had groaned, residents had complained, the company had years of warnings, and its answer was largely to keep the molasses moving. The tank stood at 529 Commercial Street, close to rail lines, freight buildings, the city paving yard, a firehouse, and nearby homes. This was not an isolated industrial zone where a failure would inconvenience a few seagulls. It sat inside a busy working neighborhood. Italian and Irish families lived beside laborers, teamsters, freight workers, children, and animals moving through the district. Industry and daily life occupied the same small area. That made the location convenient for the company and dangerous for everyone around it. Purity Distilling built the tank in 1915 during wartime demand for industrial alcohol. By 1917, United States Industrial Alcohol controlled the operation. Senior management authorized the project, but the practical decisions fell largely to Arthur Gell, Purity's treasurer and project manager. Gell's experience was in finance and administration, not engineering. He could not properly read construction blueprints and did not consult a qualified engineer or architect. Yet he selected the site, hired Hammond Ironworks, and instructed the manufacturer to use a safety factor of 3 without professional advice. Hammond designed, fabricated, and assembled the tank. Court evidence later showed that some delivered steel plates were thinner than the project specifications. The contract also called for the completed tank to be tested with water, but Gell did not authorize a proper full-capacity test. Only about 6 inches of water went in before the tank was placed into service because a molasses ship was arriving. 6 inches. For a tank expected to hold millions of gallons, the city did not provide the missing safety check. Officials classified the tank as a receptacle rather than a building. Only its foundation needed the normal permit, and no registered engineer was required to certify the full structure. Then the tank began leaking. Residents heard the metal groan. Complaints came in. None of this was secret. The tank was basically submitting its own maintenance reports. Parts were patched, and the outside was painted to disguise the seepage. A coat of paint can help a bedroom wall. It is less convincing when the wall is holding millions of gallons of heavy liquid. The leaks and noises continued from 1915 through 1918. Each warning offered another chance to stop and inspect the structure. Stopping production would cost money, so the warnings became background noise. Later engineering work showed that the danger went beyond poor supervision. Modern investigators concluded that the tank walls were too thin for the load. The steel was about 0.67 inches thick near the bottom and only about 0.31 inches near the top. They also identified heavily stressed rivet holes where cracks likely began. The steel contained too little manganese, making it more brittle than it should have been. In plain English, the tank had weak bones, bad joints, and a job far heavier than its construction could safely support. Then came the conditions of January 1919. On January 13th, a fresh shipment helped fill the tank nearly to capacity. Historical summaries say the incoming molasses was warmer than the material already inside. Boston had also shifted from colder weather to an unusually mild day, with temperatures above 40 degrees Fahrenheit when the tank failed. That combination mattered. Temperature changes affected how thick the molasses was and may have increased pressure inside the tank. Fermentation could also have produced carbon dioxide, adding more pressure. Researchers still debate exactly how much those factors contributed, but the order of blame is clear. Weather did not design the tank. Fermentation did not ignore the leaks. Warm molasses did not skip the safety review. Those conditions likely pushed an unsafe structure closer to failure. The basic problem was already standing beside the neighborhood, full of syrup and warning signs. Later, Retelling sometimes turned the disaster into a desperate race against prohibition because the 18th Amendment was ratified one day after the flood. But prohibition did not take effect until January 1920. It shaped the business climate. It did not physically break the tank. The real explanation was less cinematic and more familiar. Rushed work, poor oversight, ignored warnings, and a structure pushed beyond what it could handle. Wednesday, January 15th, began as an ordinary workday around Commercial Street. At lunchtime, the district held workers, freight agents, teamsters, children collecting firewood, and firefighters at Engine 31. Between about 12:30 and 12:40 p.m., the ordinary noise changed. People heard the tank rumble. Then came a hiss. The steel shell failed. The released molasses did not simply pour onto the road and form an inconvenient puddle. A full tank had stored enormous weight above street level. Once the steel opened, gravity turned that stored mass into a fast-moving surge. It struck the elevated railway structure. It crushed buildings in the North End paving yard. It wrecked the electric freight terminal and hit nearby houses, including the Cloverty family's home at 6 Copse Hill Terrace. Martin Cloverty had been asleep on the 3rd floor. The force tore the house from its foundation and drove it against the elevated railway structure. Martin woke in several feet of molasses and briefly thought he had fallen overboard. He located his sister in the wreckage, and his brother Stephen was also pulled out. Their mother, Bridget Clougherty, was killed when the house collapsed. Martin's account came from his statement to a newspaper immediately after the disaster, not from a story polished by decades of retelling. The first newspaper descriptions struggled to explain what witnesses had seen. Some called it an explosion. Others described a black wall sweeping through the area. Estimates placed the wave anywhere from roughly 15 feet to 50 feet. The safest conclusion is simple. It was large enough to overwhelm a street and too chaotic to measure properly. By midnight, newspapers knew of 11 deaths. The final official toll was 21, with about 150 people injured. Official records show that the victims ranged from age 10 to 76. 16 deaths were recorded that day, while others followed later. The human cost continued long after the tank went quiet. The behavior of the molasses created two different emergencies. At first, the sudden release moved surprisingly fast. The initial wave was estimated to have traveled at roughly 35 miles per hour. That was not a direct instrument reading from 1919. It was reconstructed from eyewitness reports, timing, and the damage. Later, fluid dynamics researchers tested whether that estimate made physical sense. Their calculations found that the first gravity-driven surge could plausibly move that fast before viscosity began slowing it. Molasses is far more viscous than water, meaning it resists flowing. But it is also dense, and millions of gallons falling under gravity do not need permission to become dangerous. Then winter changed the problem. As the molasses spread into the cold air, it cooled and became thicker. The initial surge could strike with force. The mass left behind could hold people, animals, wreckage, and rescuers in place. What moved like a wave began behaving more like a sticky landslide. Rescue started almost immediately. Police officers, firefighters, Red Cross workers, civilians, and cadets from the USS Nantucket entered the wrecked area. They worked through molasses and debris while trying to reach trapped people and clear broken structures. Ordinary water was not very effective against the coating. Salt water from the harbor and fireboats worked better at cutting through it and exposing the wreckage. Even then, nothing about the cleanup was quick. Boston Public Library records estimate that the work required more than 87,000 labor hours. Crews cut through damaged sections of the tank, cleared streets, searched collapsed buildings, and dealt with molasses that had spread far beyond the original site. The streets took weeks to clean. The harbor reportedly remained brown with molasses until summer. United States Industrial Alcohol faced an obvious question. How had its enormous tank collapsed after years of leaks and complaints? The company's answer was sabotage. It argued that anarchists had bombed the tank. In the tense political climate around the Red Scare, that claim gave the company an outside villain and turned a structural failure into an attack. It also moved attention away from the people who had designed, built, filled, and maintained the tank. Victims, families, businesses, the Boston Elevated Railway, and the city of Boston filed claims. The most common total is 119, though some later sources give 125. Rather than run separate trials, the claims were combined in Dorr versus United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The legal inquiry became enormous. Auditor Hugh W. Ogden heard 341 days of testimony. Accounts describe roughly 1,000 witnesses and more than 1,500 exhibits. Engineers argued over steel, rivets, pressure, construction, and whether an explosive device had caused the break. The defense assembled technical reports, photographs, blueprints, and detailed studies of the metal. This was not a quick hearing built around one one dramatic witness. It became a long test of whether technical evidence could cut through a company's preferred story. The proceeding continued for years because the technical questions were difficult, but the central choice was simple. Either outsiders had secretly destroyed a sound tank, or the tank had never been sound in the first place. On April 28, 1925, Ogden filed his conclusion. He rejected the sabotage theory. His findings said investigators discovered no bomb, no high explosive, and no traces of either. The disaster came from structural failure and negligent management. The tank had been poorly designed, lacked competent oversight, received no meaningful safety review, and remained in use despite warnings. The company had treated uninterrupted production as more important than the danger beside it. After years of evidence, the mysterious villain turned out to be bad engineering with a business plan. The plaintiffs received compensation, although sources disagree on the exact total. The most repeated final settlement figure is about $628,000. A standard $6,000 death award represented roughly 5 years of an average worker's 1919 earnings. That was a substantial lump sum, but it did not replace the wages and support that a family had permanently lost. The larger result was public accountability. The flood did not invent professional engineering rules. Wyoming had passed the first engineering licensure law in 1907, and other states acted before 1919. But the Boston case became a powerful example of why large structures needed qualified designers, checked calculations, signed plans, permits, and real inspection. It also showed what a court could do with a corporate disaster. Ogden's inquiry took a bizarre event and reduced it to decisions, materials, pressure, warnings, and responsibility. The flood was unusual. The pattern behind it was painfully ordinary. Today, the tank is gone. The site lies beneath Langone Park and nearby recreational space. In 2019, a geophysical survey found likely remains of the tank's base slightly northwest of its position on an old map. A strong signal appeared about 50 centimeters below the modern ground. There is also a small plaque near the park, easy to miss. For decades, local stories claimed that the smell of molasses still returned on hot days. That is how the disaster survives in Boston, beneath a place where children now play and beside a half-hidden marker, and inside a lesson written by a tank that leaked, groaned, and was painted over until it finally gave way.